Hey everybody, thank you for joining me. Today we're taking a look at Oculus, a company that started as a little Kickstarter and grew to become a global tech giant. How did they do it? We're going to find out. Now before we jump into the video, please, if you enjoy this, press that like button and make sure you subscribe to my channel so you catch all my content coming up. 95% of people who watch my videos are not yet subscribed. Help me out, thank you very much. So it all starts in a trailer in Long Beach, California. A 16-year-old boy named Palmer Luckey develops an obsession with sci-fi and in particular the holy grail of good virtual reality. Now it's not like people haven't harboured these aspirations before. There have been many attempts at virtual reality but nothing that stood the test of time. There'd been the Sensorama, a system that combined smell with immersive films. There'd been the iPhone 1, the 80s VR headset. There'd been the Sword of Damocles, an enormous ceiling-hung head-mounted device that was really cumbersome and hard to manage. And the final nail in the coffin was Nintendo's now infamous Virtual Boy, a console that promised so much and delivered so little, becoming Nintendo's biggest disappointment and largest commercial failure. The 90s had brought promise of the virtual reality revolution, but it ended by marking with a point that we just weren't ready for this tech yet. But then along comes Palmer Luckey. Palmer Luckey would sit in his trailer in his parents' yard, modding consoles to turn them into portable devices, known as what is called a portabilizer. Luckey ran a website called Mod Retro dedicated to these portabilizers, and it was an interesting pastime. It showed technical prowess, but was never going to really lead to much. But this hobby meant that Luckey spent most of his time on eBay searching for old tech, and it was during these searches that he would stumble upon used virtual reality devices. Luckey knew that working on these devices could have a much bigger impact than turning an NES into the world's biggest Game Boy. Luckey began to tinker and his obsession started to grow. Within a very short amount of time, he developed one of the world's biggest collections of retro virtual reality devices. As his obsession grew, he developed the idea of his own perfect prototype that he gave the moniker the Rift because of the rift between our reality and the virtual reality. It would be a self-assembly kit to make a high-end, enthusiast virtual reality headset that would be good. When thinking of a name for his company, Luckey settled on the name Oculus, meaning small window or opening. He chose this because it distanced the company from the word virtual reality that had developed such a stigma from these failed past attempts. The idea was to build these self-assembly kits and sell them for hundreds, not thousands, making it easy for someone to get into the area if they had the passion that he had. Elsewhere, another man was going on a similar journey. That man's name was John Carmack, the legendary developer and creator of id Software that brought us the likes of Doom, Quake and Wolfenstein. The man was a legend. Now he's known for taking small breaks from his work to dedicate a bit of time to passion projects. Now in 2012, Carmack decided to dedicate some time to the idea of virtual reality. Carmack looked at what was on the market and he found the tech that was out there laughably bad. The latency was so high it made them unusable and the FOV was so small that they just weren't immersive. Now, Carmack's time ran out before he could really get too stuck into the idea, but he was making progress. He knew if he wanted to progress further, he needed some sort of financial reason to make it worthwhile. So, Carmack had a brainwave. He would team up his up-and-coming release of the remaster of Doom 3 BFG edition, meaning Big Fucking Gun edition, and he would time it to partner up with a virtual reality playable version that he would put together himself. But Carmack could see that there was no tech out there that was good enough to sort of team up with the game and make it playable and enjoyable. So he was going to need to apply the Carmack magic touch and do something himself. That led him to the internet, where he stumbled upon Palmer Luckey and their paths converged. Carmack reached out to Luckey and expressed some interest in the two working together. Luckey actually agreed to send Carmack the only working prototype he had of his own Rift so that Carmack could see it. And that happened. Carmack was blown away. This was miles ahead of the things he'd seen on the market so far. When Carmack received that prototype, he described it as dramatically better than anything else out there, and he said it would enable the wearer to see the future. That's awesome, and it's quite a commendation coming from such a big name. Carmack was quickly approaching E3 conference and he really wanted to take the Rift there to show to people. Luckey agreed that Carmack could take it along and show it to a few select people. This happened and a buzz instantly created around this mystical tech that no one had heard about.
A guy named Palmer Luckey, it's called the Oculus Rift, and he built this in his workshop. I added my sensors and a strap to hold it on. But for the hacker maker crowd, this is going to be amazingly cool.
This gave Luckey a boost and it encouraged him to start a Kickstarter project to really launch the idea of the Rift. So he spoke to his friend Chris Dicus for some advice, and they formulated the first workings of Oculus's first Kickstarter project. This is where three other important names enter our conversation. Meet Brendan Irive, Michael Entonoff, and Nate Mitchell. Now, Irive and Entonoff have been working together at their company Scaleform, where they'd worked on the GFX programs that brought us the graphics scene in the likes of Crysis and Mass Effect. And they teamed up with Nate Mitchell when they all joined the company Gaikai. These guys were software giants and they'd earned a fortune in this area. But they wanted to move on to something new, and they had stumbled upon Palmer's work, and they found their interest quickly peaked. They proposed a meeting with Lucky and the guys instantly got along. They clicked. It was clear that these guys would work together well. It's said that Iribe asked Lucky, "Is it true you really sent your only working prototype to John Carmack?" And Lucky responded with a reference to Terminator, saying, "If Jesus asked to borrow your clothes, your boots and your motorcycle, you say yes." They loved this 19-year-old tech genius, but they knew his thinking was too small. He needed to think bigger. This thing could have some real impact. Now, at the same time as this was all happening, interest was starting to build and other companies were showing their interest in working with Palmer Luckey. One of those companies was Valve, the legendary PC software company that's brought us the likes of Half-Life. They reached out to Lucky and he instantly agreed to meet them. After a bit of conversation with Valve, it became clear that they didn't view VR as the sort of golden milestone to get to. They thought it was a stepping stone that would get them towards good augmented reality. Now, Sony also got in touch and expressed some interest in working with Lucky. This was very tempting. Sony are an enormous company and could add so much weight to what he was doing. But Iribe, Mitchell and Entonoff managed to convince Lucky that he needed to stay in control of his baby. If he teamed up with someone else, he would lose it and they would make a fortune off his back. The difficulty was that Lucky knew the hardware, he could build it and he could make it, but he didn't know the software and he needed a development kit to go with this unit that would enable it to work alongside the game engines, the likes of Unreal Engine and Unity. That is where things would really click. That is how Michael Entonoff could help. He was a software genius. This guy taught himself everything. He would sit at home with books from the library on coding, literally copying out every line himself so he had the book and didn't have to buy it. He put the work in and he learned everything he needed to know. Now he was going to be an enormous help to Lucky. It was agreed that Brendan Iribe would take on the role of CEO of Oculus. He knew how to handle business decisions and he could take all of that out of Lucky's hands, freeing him up to focus on what he knew, building the hardware. So, Lucky sat down and between him and Nate Mitchell, they put together the workings of their first Kickstarter video, the promotional video that would demonstrate what they were trying to deliver.
My name is Palmer Luckey, and I'm a virtual reality enthusiast and the designer of the Rift.
This would be the video that launched their first product, the Oculus Development Kit One. Now, this was no longer a self-assembly kit, this was a fully assembled headset aimed at getting it in the hands of developers to create games and apps that would be playable on it. It was a 3 Degrees of Freedom headset similar to the likes of an Oculus Go, and it would come without a controller. You'd have to work with your PC to manage it. 3 Degrees of Freedom means it tracks what direction your head's looking, but not where you are in the room or anything else that is going on in around that room. Now, the team secured a meeting with Valve and they went out there to demonstrate what they'd managed with the Rift. This was an enormously chaotic meeting. It involved Lucky being stopped at the airport because the TSA weren't happy with him travelling with this crazy contraption he put together himself, wires hanging off all over the place, clearly looking homemade, clearly looking dangerous. So he was stopped from flying. That meant he missed the first meeting. When they eventually managed to reschedule, he turned up with a broken laptop. But his tech was so impressive that Valve was still impressed. He managed to demo the headset to Michael Abrash, who was the company's sort of leading VR enthusiast and spent most of his previous years focusing on AR. And at the end of the meeting, they even managed to pull in the managing director of Valve, Gabe Newell, who himself is an absolute legend and is loved across the PC world for his sort of maverick way of thinking. Now, it became clear that both Abrash and Newell were blown away by the tech, but they weren't at this point willing to put all their weight behind it. The guys asked them to support their Kickstarter campaign with some sort of promotional video or backing, and they declined, saying, "Look, we'll have to think about it a bit more and see what we can do." The guys left feeling a bit deflated, but knowing they'd made some progress. However, a few days later, a video turned up direct from Valve with an awesome video testimonial coming from both Abrash and Gabe Newell. This would be an enormous help to the guys in launching their product.
It looks incredibly exciting. If anybody's going to tackle these set of hard problems, we think that Palmer's going to do it. So we'd strongly encourage you to support this Kickstarter.
The Kickstarter launch was priced at $300, a price that everyone in Oculus thought was ridiculous. It was much too low, with the exception of Palmer Luckey. Lucky wanted to get a headset in the hands of as many people as he could and didn't need to make profit. He thought we just need to get it out there so people can back it and get involved. The rest of the team thought they needed to earn some money so that they could further develop it. The team set what they thought was an optimistic target of $250,000 for the Kickstarter project. If they didn't meet this, they wouldn't get the funding, so it was really clear they had to. Now, they certainly did meet that target. It was one of the most successful Kickstarter projects that had been around by this point. They managed to earn an enormous $2.4 million. This meant they had their funding, they needed to go away and create that product and deliver it to the investors. It was a very unconventional build process. My favourite story from it is how they developed the eye relief for the headset. Now, they needed to get the lenses as close to the eyes as possible so you could see the most field of view when you're looking through the screen. So what they did was they got an empty headset and they drilled a hole in it, and they would turn a screw as far as they possibly could until it touched the eye of Palmer Luckey, who was wearing it. Now, that's not a job I fancy, but it worked, and it enabled them to find out exactly how close they could get to the wearer. It was at this time in the build process that their relationship with John Carmack's employer ZeniMax started to become strained, and it looked like the demo of Doom 3 was on the rocks. Now, the guys were really close to the Consumer Electronics Show where they hoped to demo their product with a game, and they didn't have anything to show, so they needed to get their heads together and put something together in-house that would really demonstrate what the Rift was capable of. Luckily, after a lot of hard work in a really short amount of time, they put some demos together, and the guys went on to have one of the most successful CESs for years. They had loads of successful demos, one of the standouts being when they showed the product to the head of the internet channel The Verge, Josh Topolsky, who described taking the headset off like coming down from an acid high. Oculus became the darling of that year's CES show, bringing home numerous awards, including Best in Show and Best Prototype. It helped so much, they had the backing of the world. As the guys entered the design phase for their second offering, the Oculus Development Kit 2, John Carmack's contract with ZeniMax was to come to a close. The guys knew they had to secure him. He'd been such a help to the company and he would make a really big difference going forwards. They needed him as a technical advisor. So they entered into negotiations with Carmack's wife, and after some tough negotiating, he actually took home the title of Chief Technical Officer. To really separate the DK1 from everything else on the market, the guys needed really strong clarity in the headset. The only way to get this was with OLED panels. But the difficulty was there was only a few companies making OLED panels and none of them were willing to sell Oculus the small quantities they needed. It just wasn't worth it to them. That led to negotiations with Samsung, in which Oculus turned up at the Samsung headquarters and demoed the Rift. The Samsung reps were enthused and clearly impressed with what they saw, enough so that they invited the team into the back office to show them what they'd been working on themselves. Now, they'd been working on some sort of VR. It was a VR headset that you would slide their newest mobile phone, the Samsung S3, into, and then you would use the S3 screen as a VR screen, partnering it together to make this sort of makeshift VR headset. They would call it the Samsung Gear VR. Now, at this point, the tech was very young and it clearly wasn't very good. The guys weren't that impressed. But Samsung said, if you work together with us to make this something good, we will help you get the OLED panels you need. So began a symbiotic relationship that led to the Oculus branded Samsung Gear VR. Palmer Luckey's next passion project would be the Oculus Touch controller. He needed to find a way to bring your hands into virtual reality. He needed the kind of precision to take a pin from a grenade while still using standard button style gaming mechanics. That was a tough challenge and they needed funding for this, so launched their second series of funding. That is how their names appeared on the desk of a man named Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg, of course famous for owning Facebook, was a serial investor and wanted to get involved in new and exciting tech. He instantly found the Oculus proposition interesting and scheduled a meeting to get down to their site. It was around this time that Oculus's first competitors emerged, because Valve announced their Steamworks VR API. This was an API that allowed developers to create games and apps for VR headsets, but not just for Oculus VR headsets, for any potential headsets on the market. This was a big blow for Oculus, who banked all their hopes on heading the sort of development side of VR and being the software go-to. That's where they were going to make their money. They weren't the only people joining the fray, because Sony announced the PSVR. This came out of nowhere, there had been no rumours and nobody was expecting this. This was a big problem. Sony were enormous. If they had the PlayStation player base on hand, who could possibly take them on? And if those two weren't bad enough, enter a company called HTC. HTC had made a fortune during the smartphone boom because they'd jumped on the bandwagon early, created a series of smartphones that made a lot of money, and then moved out of the market when it became diluted with so many other companies. They wanted to do a similar thing. They wanted to get on board with tech early and take the lead, and they had set their sights on virtual reality. They announced a product called the HTC Vive. Now this was a big problem because it made so many promises that were delivering things well above and beyond what the Oculus team were hoping to do. This was a full 6 degrees of freedom headset that tracked your position around a room. It involved controllers called the HTC Vive ones, and it was just leagues ahead of Oculus. It was a big problem. The guys needed to step things up immediately if they were to take this on. And if all that wasn't bad enough, Google entered the fray with the Google Cardboard, a really cheap VR headset made of cardboard that you slot your mobile phone into. Now this was a problem because it could pull so many people in, but it could also poison the well because it could deliver a really disappointing experience if it didn't live up to what they promised. Back at Oculus headquarters, Mark Zuckerberg had arrived. He'd seen the tech and he was really impressed. This excited the Oculus guys, who had envisioned some sort of social collaboration with Facebook, involving the Facebook app in their system. However, that very evening, Mark Zuckerberg arranged a dinner meeting with Brendan Iribe, and Zuckerberg quickly changed the conversation from collaboration to acquisition. The potential benefits of a Facebook acquisition would be enormous. They would bring so much value. They would bring capital, they would bring size, they would bring shared assets. It would really reinforce everything Oculus had, and it would possibly be enough to ensure that this venture wouldn't fail like so many previous VR ventures had. The Oculus board were hesitant. They knew how this news would be received by the general public, but they also knew how important it was. They knew that if it was to work, they needed the sales number to be high enough to make it worthwhile, so they tabled a number of $4 billion. Now this was too much for Facebook, it scared them off and they immediately retreated. But not for long, because a few days later a negotiation would undertake and a price would be agreed of $2.3 billion with a further payment towards the founders. Now this was massive, and the guys couldn't say no. Word got out that Oculus had been acquired, and the backlash was immediate and immense. People viewed Facebook as the evil overlord, and everyone was upset. Palmer Luckey received numerous death threats and didn't know what to do. After releasing many press releases showing their continued commitment to the original plan, the guys continued and launched their next product. It's now January 2016 and the team are ready to release the consumer version of the Rift. They were going up against some really strong competition by this point, and they had to make some tough decisions, and it became quickly clear where the power lay within the company. Mark Zuckerberg held really differing opinions from those of the founders, but it was Zuckerberg's opinions that would be progressed. This created a fractured work environment within the company. It was at this point in mid-2016 that Luckey made a decision that would potentially impact his life forever. Luckey decided to back an internet group called Nimble America. Nimble America were a pro-Trump internet group, and they created internet meme-style billboards that sort of promoted Donald Trump and put down Hillary Clinton. Luckey was a long-time Donald Trump fan. He loved his business-style approach, and he agreed with lots of his views. This would not go down well in Silicon Valley, an area that was really left-wing and massively opposed to everything Donald Trump stood for. Luckey made an anonymous donation of $10,000 and he became the face behind a campaign known as Nimble Rich Man, in which an anonymous rich person backed Donald Trump and gave his views out in public. Now, although at this point Luckey was anonymous, he wouldn't stay anonymous for long. After a series of Chinese whispers, word made it out to a news group called the Daily Beast that Luckey might be the face behind the campaign, and they set up a meeting with Luckey. Now, in a conversation that Luckey thought was off the record, he confirmed that he was the man behind the campaign and that he had made a donation towards the company. Now, it quickly became clear that this conversation wasn't actually off the record, as Luckey hadn't agreed that ahead of time. So the company went ahead and released a news briefing that announced Luckey was the man behind the campaign. This did not go down well at all. We see an enormous public backlash where the founder of Oculus is linked to this group, and this group actually goes on to be linked to white supremacist posts. It turns out later that these links weren't substantiated, but at the time it was so hard to disrefute in such a number. At first it became clear that the Facebook team expected Luckey to resign because of this, but Luckey pushed back. He thought Oculus was his life and he didn't want to go anywhere. The team got their heads together and they put together a press release that would go on Luckey's personal Facebook, announcing that he was the man behind the campaign, but explaining his decisions, explaining his reasoning and distancing himself from the Trump campaign. But that was not enough to subdue the furore. Luckey quickly became the most hated man in Silicon Valley. Luckey was to go on an extended hiatus, but the Oculus train wouldn't stop without him. It was during this time that Oculus held their next Oculus Connect event, where they would announce the Oculus Touch controller that Lucky had been working on and Project Santa Cruz, what would go on to be named the Oculus Quest, a standalone virtual reality headset that used inside-out tracking, worked with a PC and had no wires to base stations. It was a big step forward for tech and could pull so many people into the market. After an investigation into Nimble America, it was found that no wrongdoing was done on Lucky's part and he was eventually due to return to Oculus. However, before he could return, John Carmack's previous employer, ZeniMax, came forwards and decided to sue Oculus for the work that Carmack had done whilst working for them. It was argued that a lot of the tech that was released by Oculus was benefiting from work done by ZeniMax, and that Lucky had actually stolen ideas straight out of Carmack's hands. After heated court proceedings, it was decided that Oculus would have to pay ZeniMax £500 million. They found breaches on parts of Oculus, but specifically on parts of Brendan Iribe and Palmer Luckey. Now this was later lowered to $250,000, and they did take away those breaches by Luckey and Iribe, but this would appear to be the final straw for Palmer Luckey. It quickly became clear that he would not be returning to Oculus, and his lawyer informed him he was due to be fired. Now that wasn't enough to stop Oculus, the company would still continue, just without Luckey. Following this, the Oculus plan developed and became incredibly effective. They launched the Oculus Rift S and the Oculus Quest, both at compelling prices, and drew interest across the globe. But the sales remained short of what would be needed to make it a mainstream endeavour. The biggest challenge was that VR's low player base made it really difficult for developers to earn any real money. Oculus's competitors continued to put out more and more headsets, and they were specifically targeting the high-end PC VR market, the standouts being the likes of the offerings from Pimax and Valve's now infamous Valve Index, real top-end PC enthusiast gear. But Oculus didn't seem to be sharing this sentiment. That isn't where they were targeting their sights. There were some big hitting games at the time that had managed to sell, one of the standouts being Beat Saber by Beat Games. Nearly every VR player had this. So Oculus sought to bring the studio on board, and they acquired Beat Games in 2019. Oculus was still thinking long term. They needed to get as many people onto the platform as possible and create content that sold to the masses. The biggest win in the VR arms race came in September 2020 when Oculus announced the Quest 2. Whilst other companies were focusing on just high-end PC VR and pushing specs further at that end, the Quest 2 would be an incredibly powerful standalone headset, running on an Android Snapdragon XR2 chip. It could run competitive games without a PC, but it could also connect to a PC and become a very high-definition PC VR headset competitive with the high-end. All of this for just $300. The price was insane, and it was miles below what any other company would charge for this kind of tech. But it worked. It pulled in the mainstream and it outsold the previous generations tenfold. It was the basis of Oculus creating that user base that they needed to make this a mainstream endeavour. At the same time, Oculus continued to purchase the studios that were making the best-selling games. The standouts for me being Big Box Studios, Downpour Interactive and Ready at Dawn all came to form part of Oculus Studios. With more and more content being made specifically for the Quest 2 because that's where the market share was, we found less and less being made specifically for PC VR. This led to a visual downgrade in many cases, to the disappointment of those early enthusiasts. But you have to understand the position of developers. Why make a game for such a small market when they can downgrade the visuals and make it for a much wider audience and actually earn some money in doing so? We've now had the Quest 2 for over 9 months and it just continues to get better and better and better. They've released software updates that push it even further down the line into a high-end product. We've got things like 120Hz tracking, AR home integration and wireless PC play out of the box. All really impressive, and they make it an incredibly compelling product for the £300 price tag. With regular briefings from the Oculus Studios, it's clear that their ambition hasn't stopped and they want to push us further into the future. That brings us to now. Oculus are dominating the space and the challenges look feeble. It's not clear where we go from here, but one thing is clear for certain: Oculus will be at the heart of it. Now, there's so much more to the story of Oculus that I couldn't tell you about today in the short time we had. So if you want to know more, I'd encourage you to read the book The History of the Future by Blake J. Harris. It's where loads of these stories came from. It's an incredible read. I recommend it to anyone who likes virtual reality, tech or business in general. It's really good. Now before you go, just one favour, please press the like button and subscribe to my channel so you can catch my videos that are coming up in the future, because I would absolutely love to see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.